early autumn wind moved through Rowan Ridge Valley slow and steady, like an unseen hand smoothing the grass before winter came down. Naomi Carter pulled her thin cloak tighter, her needle-worn fingers trembling slightly as she sat in the back of the old wagon. The shop owner in town had said the Rowan family needed urgent measurements for a formal garment. "Good pay," he'd told her. "Go, Naomi. Luck might be waiting." She believed him. She wanted to believe him. Sometimes belief was the only thing a poor black girl could carry. But when the wagon turned onto the road leading to Rowan Ridge Ranch, her heart stalled. Lanterns hung from the porch to the trees, bright enough to make the whole valley look lit from within. Horses, fine carriages, long silk gowns sweeping the ground. The largest house in the region had turned into a castle for an engagement party she knew nothing about. Naomi stepped down with the shaken feeling she had walked into someone else's world. Holding her sewing bag close, she climbed the stone steps. Expensive perfume mixed with the high laughter of well-dressed white women made her throat go dry. Some turned to look, not curious, but as if spotting a stain on a grand carpet. "New house help?" a woman with a champagne glass asked, making no attempt to soften her tone. Naomi didn't speak in time. The nearby group burst out laughing. "Good God, look at that little bag she's holding. She probably came to beg for mending work." Naomi bowed her head, hoping to slip past and find someone to ask about the measurements. But everyone seemed too busy to see her, except a drunken man with a red face and unsteady feet. He blocked her path, liquor heavy on his breath. "What are you doing here, little girl?" he said loud enough to draw eyes. "The Rowan-Sutherland engagement doesn't welcome country strays." Laughter followed. Those sounds cut sharper than any needle she'd handled. Naomi stepped back, her heel catching on the edge of the carpet. She stumbled, her sewing bag falling, everything tilted. A strong hand caught her elbow before she hit the floor. Naomi looked up. Warm lamplight struck the angled face of the man who had steadied her. His dark gray eyes stayed on hers long enough to stop her breath. His hand anchored her shoulder, steady, controlled, as if saving her was something he'd done 1,000 times. Caleb Rowan, owner of the land, a man whose name made the entire town go still for a heartbeat. Caleb turned to the drunk, his voice low and rough as rock cracking under a horse's hoof. "She's no stray." Whispers rippled nearby. Naomi wanted to explain, to say she'd only come for measurements, and this was a misunderstanding. But Caleb leaned toward her, his hand still warm on her shoulder, and her legs weakened. Then he said the words that shattered the entire party, without warning, without looking at her or permission. "She is my wife." The room split open, music stopped. Glasses stilled. Women stared, mouths parted. The drunk stepped back like doused in cold water. Naomi froze, ears ringing, her heartbeat slamming against her ribs as if trying to break free. Caleb still held her, his hand firm on her trembling shoulder. His eyes didn't leave her face, as if what he'd said was not a sudden claim, but a truth that had been waiting. And in that single moment, when Naomi didn't know whether to breathe or run, her life veered onto a new road, a road she had never dared imagine, a road named Fake Wife. Caleb all but pulled Naomi out of the crowd before she could react. Whispered murmurs followed them like a cold draft. Only when they reached the back hallway did Caleb let go. Naomi stepped back half a pace, trying to steady her breath. Her heart still pounded as if the words, "my wife," had struck her square in the chest. She asked, barely above a whisper, "Why? Why did you say that?" Caleb looked at her for a few seconds, the way a man looks when he's crossed a line he never planned to approach. Then he exhaled, running a hand through his hair as if untangling his own thoughts. "To avoid a marriage my mother arranged 2 years ago," he said, "and to stop them from turning you into a spectacle." Naomi lowered her head. Humiliation lingered in her chest like embers that refused to die. "I don't want to be anyone's burden," she said. "You're not a burden." Caleb's answer came fast, almost cutting. His gaze locked on hers, steady enough to make her look away. They walked down the hall toward the west study. The large wooden room was still, lamplight low, the faint scent of resin in the air. Caleb opened the door and gestured for her to enter. Naomi stood before the wide desk, feeling as if she had stepped into the realm of someone who could command an entire valley, while she was only a poor black seamstress, still shaking from the chaos of the past hour. Caleb pulled a stack of papers from a drawer and set them before her. "I don't like circling around things," he said, voice even and firm. "Tonight I called you my wife. If we don't make it real enough, by morning the whole town will be here asking." Naomi stayed silent. "So," he continued, "I'm proposing a contracted marriage. 1 year. After that we part ways." She looked up. "Why? Choose me?" Caleb turned to the window as if searching the answer in the dark outside. "Because when I saw you standing there, I saw someone who didn't want trouble but was dragged into the center of cruelty. Someone who didn't deserve it." Then he faced her again, his gaze holding hers. "And because you don't belong to that false world." His words struck something inside her. Not because they were kind, but because it had been a long time since anyone looked at her as a whole person, not as the black seamstress people forced her to be. Caleb pushed the paper toward her. Naomi read the lines trembling under the lamplight. "Pretend to be Caleb Rowan's wife for 12 months. Reside at Rowan Ridge Ranch, receive monthly compensation, be granted a dressmaking shop in town, all medical debts of Naomi's mother paid by Caleb, final clause. No emotional attachment, hearts unbound." Naomi paused at the last line. "Is that truly necessary?" Caleb held her gaze for a long time. "Yes." She didn't know what past wound drove a man like him, strong, respected, owner of vast land, to need such a sentence as armor. But she knew one truth. The poor had few choices. Her mother had been sick for 2 years. Her small sewing corner barely kept them alive. An offer like this could not be refused. Yet something twisted in her chest, a quiet warning that signing this paper was not only stepping into a new life, but stepping toward a pain she hadn't seen yet. "You must be certain," Caleb said. Naomi tightened her grip on the page to keep her hand from shaking. "I have nothing to be certain about, except my mother needs medicine, and I need work to survive." Caleb dipped his head slightly. His eyes then were not pitying, but softened by something faint, almost fragile. When Naomi signed, the room was so quiet she heard the scratch of ink against paper. Caleb held the contract for a long breath, then set it down. "From now on, they'll believe you're my wife. We'll have to act the part." Naomi nodded. "I understand." Caleb stepped closer, close enough for her to feel his breath against her cheek. He only meant to lift her cloak back onto her shoulders, but the moment stretched longer than necessary. Long enough for her to see something in his eyes that did not match the line he had written about unbound hearts. Something neither of them could name. Something that made her heart lose a beat. Naomi arrived at Rowan Ridge Ranch on a morning when the scent of fresh earth felt like the first breath of the day. Early season sunlight slanted across the gray timber and washed the main porch in a warm, quiet glow. The room Caleb prepared for her sat on the upper floor, its large window opening toward the valley where wind carried the sway of grass and the pale line of distant mountains. The room was larger than any place she had ever lived, filled with a kind of light that rarely belonged to the homes of the poor. In the corner, Caleb had set up a small sewing space, a thick wooden table, a rack for thread, a metal box of brand-new needles. Naomi stood before it for a long time. That quiet thoughtfulness did not match a cold contract on paper. It felt softer, steadier, and she didn't know what to do with the feeling it stirred. Caleb stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, his gaze calm and deep. "If you need anything, say so." Naomi turned, nodding once. "Thank you." He returned a small nod, then walked ahead to lead her toward the workers' quarters. "I set aside a room for your mother," Caleb said as they crossed the sunlit yard. "She'll be well cared for." Naomi wanted to thank him, but her throat tightened. Her mother sat on the wooden bed, taking in everything with a mix of wonder and worry. Naomi held her hand, feeling the same warmth she'd known since childhood. Caleb stood at a respectful distance, far enough not to intrude, close enough to show he had handled everything. The first days passed in a quiet, cautious rhythm. Naomi adjusted to the wide-open pace of ranch life, hooves striking the yard, lumber clacking as hands repaired fences, laughter rising each evening when everyone gathered for supper. She often brought cornbread she made herself, and it earned her quick affection. "Mrs. Rowan cooks real good," one ranch hand said, then flushed when he remembered the title was temporary. Naomi smiled slightly. Just Naomi. But it didn't change what they called her. Maybe because Caleb had declared her his wife before the whole town. Maybe because they noticed the way he stood a few steps from her, his gaze lingering longer than necessary, as if he were trying to understand her from the smallest details. One evening, they ate together. When Naomi stepped around him to set a ladle down, her hand brushed the back of his, a touch so light it could have been a gust of wind, yet it made both of them pause. Caleb didn't pull away at once. Naomi lowered her eyes, her heartbeat shifting into a rhythm she'd never known in the years she had scraped by in poverty. After supper, Caleb pulled out her chair. A polite gesture, but his look was not simple politeness. It held longer, deeper, as if he wanted to say something they both knew he wasn't allowed to say. He turned first, but she noticed the slight tension in his shoulders, as if he too was wrestling with the boundary he had drawn himself. That night, Naomi sat in her sewing corner, lamplight flickering over spools of colored thread. She stitched a straight line on a piece of white cloth, but her hand trembled, sending the needle off course. She set it down and leaned back. The day's small moments, the way he looked at her, his low voice calling her name, the chair he pulled out, the brief touch of their hands, they all returned, like slow waves that refused to fade. She closed her eyes and breathed in. She had entered this house with a contract, a clear boundary, a promise to keep herself safe. But she had not considered one truth. Boundaries are not always on paper. Sometimes they are inside the chest, and they can blur without warning. She opened her eyes and looked toward the window. Caleb's silhouette appeared in the porch light, standing still for a moment, as if deep in thought before walking away. And for the first time since arriving at Rowan Ridge, Naomi felt a small, real fear, not of him, but of herself. A fear that she was beginning to cross the lines of that contract. The morning Caleb took Naomi into town, early sunlight broke across the old red roofs. Dusthaven's streets were still thin with people. Only a few shopkeepers were lifting their shutters, hinges scraping through the cold air. Naomi sat in the wagon with her hands clasped. She didn't know what Caleb intended, only that he had said, "There's something you need to see." When the wagon stopped in front of a 2-story wooden building on the corner of Main Street, Naomi went still. On the morning-fogged window, fresh gold lettering gleamed. Carter Sewing and Design. Naomi stepped down, unable to walk closer. The feeling rising in her was sharp enough to hurt, because joy that big often came wrapped in the fear of not deserving it. "You did all this?" she asked quietly. Caleb stood beside her, hands in his coat pockets, eyes on her rather than the shop. "You need a place to stand on your own, not a life tied to a contract. This is yours." No thanks she could speak would fit the moment. She placed her hand on the door and drew a steady breath before stepping into the warm gold of the room. Soft bolts of fabric, bright shears, wooden forms still carrying the scent of new resin. Almost everything inside was beyond anything she had ever dared to dream. On opening day, the town came in larger numbers than she expected. Middle-aged women who had only ever ordered from the old tailor lined up at her counter. They were curious at first about her sharp, clean stitches, then persuaded by her calm hands, her patience, and the way she listened. Within weeks, Naomi became the person Dusthaven's women sought when they wanted a dress that made them feel seen and respected. They called her Miss Carter with a quiet regard. Some even shared their burdens while fitting, stories of children, of husbands who grumbled, of dreams set aside for years. But where there is light, there is shadow. Rumors spread like seasonal wind. The mysterious black wife of Caleb Rowan. They must have married for money. That girl doesn't fit the Rowan family at all. Naomi heard them in the market, heard them spoken as if she were invisible. Each whisper was a small needle, not enough to break her, but enough to sting in the hidden places. Still, she told herself, if she was standing here now, she would not let anyone push her down. That day, she worked until long after dusk. When Caleb arrived to take her home, she could barely stay upright in the wagon. The wheels rolled over soft dirt, lamplight flickering like a thin breath. For a long while, Caleb said nothing. He only glanced over when her head began to nod. When she leaned too far, he reached out and steadied her without a word. She rested against his shoulder, her breath soft and even like a child after a long day. Caleb stayed still. He didn't lift her away, didn't step back, didn't break the quiet moment. He simply sat there, letting her rest against him, looking at the dark, road ahead, as if having Naomi on his shoulder was something long familiar. By the time they reached the ranch, Naomi was too tired to open her eyes. Caleb lifted her from the wagon, each step steady and deliberate. He set her on the edge of her bed, then knelt to remove her shoes. One hand held her ankle, the other unfastened each tie. There was nothing heated in the gesture, yet it was intimate enough to force him to draw a deep breath to keep steady. When the shoes fell to the floor, Naomi blinked awake. "You didn't need to do that," she murmured. "You're too tired to do it yourself," he said, voice low and quiet. Naomi looked at him in the dim room, light softening his features, bringing them close, real. And in that moment, she understood something. Caleb's care no longer belonged to the contract. It was warmer, still, and more dangerous. Somewhere deep in her chest, something shifted. Something that could undo everything. That evening, the sky darkened faster than it should have. From the sewing room window, Naomi saw the clouds roll like someone was pulling a storm blanket down from the mountains. Wind slammed against the porch roof, Metal clattered like a warning. The ranch sank into shadow, save for a few lights near the stables. Naomi was gathering her threads when the first thunder cracked, strong enough to make the room tremble. She feared thunder, an old fear she never spoke of, believing grown women shouldn't shake at the sound of the sky. But that night, the thunder hit like it was striking straight at her chest. When the front door swung open, Naomi spun around. Caleb stepped inside, soaked through, his shirt clinging to him as if painted on every line of his frame. His hair was wild from the wind, rain running down his jaw. Firelight caught him in a way that made it hard for Naomi to breathe. He was lightly drunk, the kind that didn't stagger, but deepened his voice and lengthened his gaze. "You're still up," he said, rain and whiskey on his breath. "I was cleaning up," she answered, trying not to look at the water dripping from his shirt to the floor. Caleb pulled off his heavy coat and hung it on the rack. His shirt was wet enough to trace the strength of his shoulders, something Naomi hadn't expected to see at only a few steps away. She turned too quickly, searching for something to do with her cold hands. "The rain's heavier than I thought," she said, mostly to ground herself. Caleb didn't answer. He stood near the fire, hands stretched toward it as if he were trying to warm whatever the drink had stirred inside him. Naomi hovered at the edge of the room, unsure whether to move closer. But the rain, the wind, the thunder, all of it pressed the walls inward until she had no choice but to step toward the only warmth, the fire, and him. She stopped less than an arm's length from him. Firelight touched her face and reflected in his eyes. The silence between them thickened like a rope tugging them in. A sharp thunderbolt split the sky. Naomi startled, and Caleb's hand closed around hers. Not to comfort, not to reassure, but as a pure, instinctive pull, as if he had waited all evening for one chance to touch her. Heat rushed from his palm straight into her chest. Her breath caught. Her feet shifted back half a step, but her hand did not leave his. Caleb looked at their joined hands, then at her face, his gaze deepening like a shadow falling. She wanted to pull away. She knew she should. The contract allowed no crossing of lines, but her heart refused to obey. Caleb stepped closer, close enough that Naomi had to lift her face to meet his eyes. His breath brushed her skin, warm, heavy, full of words he wouldn't say. It felt like if someone touched the air between them, both would break like fire meeting wind. Caleb lowered his face a fraction. Just a fraction. Enough for Naomi to feel his mouth hovering over hers, separated by a breath thin as silk. She closed her eyes for a moment, no larger than a falling speck of dust. But Caleb stopped. His breath touched her lips. Then he pulled back half a step, as if dragging himself away from the edge he was moments from crossing. "Naomi," he whispered, his voice rough like a confession. She opened her eyes. In Caleb's gaze, she saw the truth. It wasn't that he didn't want her. He was holding on to the final clause of the contract. Outside, the rain hammered the roof like 100 hands knocking. But inside that small room, what had happened, and what had not, was enough to leave them both standing still with uneven breaths and unsteady hearts. Caleb turned away first. Naomi curled the hand he had held, warmth still pressed into her skin. And they both knew, without saying a word, tonight, they had come too close to the line. One breath more, and nothing would return to the way it was. That night, the storm had long passed. The air turned strangely still, as if the wide land itself was waiting for them to speak the truth both had avoided. Naomi sat in the parlor, a half-finished stitch in her hands. Warm lamplight fell over the table, over her small fingers, over the quiet between them. Caleb stood in the doorway, silent like a man unsure whether to step forward or turn back. He had stood there for a long while, and she knew. Even without looking, she knew. "Did you want to say something?" Naomi asked, her voice soft but steady. Caleb stepped in, slow, as if measuring each choice. He sat in the chair across from her, leaning back slightly, eyes watching her through the flicker of the fire. No whiskey, no rain, no excuse to blame anything except the truth. "Naomi," he began, then stopped, the words lost in the space between them. At last, he drew a deep breath. "Why did you agree to help me that night?" Naomi set down her embroidery frame. Her hand paused for a beat. This wasn't a question about the contract, or the money, or the pressure of the moment. It was about the first look, her standing alone under the weight of contempt, and him standing alone beneath a lifetime of expectations that never touched his heart. She answered softly, "Because you looked like someone who needed to be chosen. Just once." Caleb flinched, as if she had touched a wound no one had ever seen. Firelight darkened his eyes, deepened them. "Chosen?" he whispered. "Yes," Naomi said. "Not for your land, not for your family's empire, for you." Silence fell, gentle but heavy. Caleb braced his hands on his knees, head bowed. He wasn't used to being seen that clearly, not used to being touched in the place he kept hidden. When he lifted his head, his gaze had changed. Softer, stripped of armor. "Naomi," his voice was almost hoarse. "No one has ever said that to me." She didn't reply, she didn't need to. What she'd spoken had already become a quiet undercurrent running through the night. Caleb reached forward, slow, so slow it felt like touching mist. Naomi looked at his hand for a few seconds. Then she placed her hand in his, light as a breath. 1 beat. 2. On the third, he closed his fingers around hers. Naomi didn't remember who leaned in first. Only the warmth of his breath on her cheek, the faint scent of pine on his shirt, the crackle of the fire. And then, the distance vanished. The kiss touched her with such softness, her heart trembled like a leaf in wind. No urgency, no demand, nothing like anything she had imagined. Just the breaking open of everything they had tried to silence for weeks. Naomi gripped his shirt lightly, feeling the tension in Caleb's body as he fought to hold the last thread of restraint. Then he released a long breath, as if admitting what he had battled far too long. He wrapped his arms around her, slow and full. Naomi, just her name, but enough to tell her. He had lost the moment she stepped into his life. They left the contract behind, left logic, left fear. For a few shared breaths, there were only two people drawn to each other for reasons that had nothing to do with duty. The night was quiet, unhurried, free of possession. It was gentle in the way only the deeply wounded can be when they finally find understanding where they never expected it. Caleb traced the curve of Naomi's back lightly, as if afraid he was dreaming. Naomi leaned her forehead to his neck, feeling his heartbeat stumble. The rest of the night passed in warm breath, in clasped hands that didn't want to part, in silence rich with everything unspoken. But when the first light of morning slipped through the curtain, everything shifted. Caleb woke first, sat up first, and looked down at Naomi sleeping in his arms, not with the gaze of a man who had found happiness, but with the gaze of someone who remembered a vow never to let his heart open again. The old fear, the one that had haunted him since his first marriage, returned. And he realized, last night might have changed everything, or destroyed it. The morning after that night was so clear it hardly seemed a storm had passed. Early sun fell across the wooden fence, soft and still, as if the world wanted to pretend nothing had happened between Naomi and Caleb. But that very calm unsettled her. She woke late, the blanket still carrying the warmth of the night before, the faint scent of pine from his shirt lingering on the pillow. She sat up, touching the space where Caleb had lain. It was cold. Caleb wasn't in the parlor, nor the stables, nor the front yard. Naomi walked through the house, hope and worry tangled in her chest. When she opened the study door, she saw him standing with his back to her, hands braced on the desk. His stance was rigid, like a stone that might crumble if he let out even a single breath. "Caleb?" Her voice was soft, but it strained the air. He didn't turn. "You're awake. About last night, No." He turned then. His eyes weren't angry, not cold, just exhausted. "We made a mistake." Naomi felt her heart sink slowly, painfully, like a tightened string pulled past its limit. "What are you saying? That wasn't a mistake, it was—" "Naomi." His voice cut in, low and rough, like wind scraping dry earth. "We broke the contract. And when the contract is broken, you have to go." The words didn't land like speech. They struck like a blade. Naomi stepped back. "Go? Because of one night we chose each other?" Caleb's grip on the desk tightened until his knuckles went white. He avoided her eyes like a man afraid the truth might break him open. "Naomi, you don't understand. I can't love again." "Why?" It wasn't anger. It was pain too deep to rise into anger. Caleb closed his eyes. The answer wasn't new. It had lived in him for years. "When I was 26, he said slowly, I married someone. A union arranged by our families. She was beautiful, proper, everything the Rowan name required." Naomi stood still, her hands falling to her sides. Caleb went on, voice even but muted like ash. "She said she loved me, but that love was never for me. She loved the name, the land, the wealth. I was only a stepping stone for the future she wanted." A cold ripple moved through Naomi. "And then?" she asked. "She ran away," Caleb said. "The night before our first anniversary. Left a note. 'Don't look for me. I want freedom.'" He gave a short, humorless laugh, thin, brittle. That freedom was running off with another man. Naomi heard the quiet fracture in his voice, a pain no longer sharp, but so old it had settled into fear. "I'm not her," Naomi said, stepping closer. "I know." He lifted his head, and the look in his eyes made her want to cry. "You're better than she ever was. Better. To a point where I can't allow myself to love you. Caleb, if I love you, Naomi, I won't be able to let you go. And I'm not allowed to make that mistake again." It sounded more like a confession than a decision, but it was still final. "You must leave Rowan Ridge," Caleb said, turning his face away to avoid her tears. "Today." Naomi couldn't speak. She didn't scream, didn't blame, didn't cling. She simply stood there, like someone who'd had every breath pulled from her lungs. When she finally turned away, her steps unsteady, Caleb clenched his hands into fists, but stayed where he was. He heard the door close, heard her footsteps fade, heard silence spill through the house like a shadow falling over his life. An hour later, his mother walked into the study, her face cold as early winter ice. "You just sent away the only person who ever loved you honestly." Caleb didn't react. He stood like a man who had struck his own chest. "You don't understand," he said. "No," she replied. "You're the one who understands nothing." When she left, Caleb stared out the window, the same doorway Naomi had once entered with gentle eyes and hands marked with thread. Now it was only empty space, and Caleb knew. He had pushed happiness out of his own life with his own hands. The day Naomi left Rowan Ridge was a day so bright it felt cruel. Sunlight lay across the dirt road, the young grass, her small arms holding a cloth bag. Everything shone, except her heart, which felt dark. When she returned to town and opened the door of her sewing shop, she thought work might dull the ache. She cleaned the table, folded fabric, measured patterns, movements she had always known, yet tonight they felt foreign, as if she were using someone else's hands. A customer asked, "Are you tired today, Naomi?" She smiled, a thin smile, like a thread about to snap. A dress she stitched that afternoon slipped beneath the needle. She jerked her hand back, seeing a tiny bead of blood appear. Only a drop, yet it made her stop for nearly an hour, because this pain was nothing compared to the one in her chest she was hiding. She told herself she had only been a stand-in, a role in a contract, nothing more. But the image of Caleb the night before, his eyes, his breath, the way he held her as if afraid to lose her, kept returning, as persistent as early winter wind. At the ranch, Caleb stood inside the stable, still wearing last night's wrinkled shirt. The smell of earth, grass, and rain lingered in the air, but none of it weighed as heavy as Naomi's absence. He sat on the wooden step, pressing his hand to his forehead. A fence needed fixing. A horse had a fever. A list of chores waited. But he couldn't do any of them. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Naomi walking away from the wide wooden door of the ranch, a sight that terrified him more than any storm. Caleb had always believed himself stronger than pain. But that morning he realized he was not stronger than the loss he created himself. His mother found him as the sun rose over the ridge. "How long do you plan to sit here?" she asked. He didn't answer. She sat beside him. No lectures. No scolding. After a long silence, she said softly, "Caleb, I know you're afraid." He turned away, his jaw set tight. "I know you were abandoned. I know you think if you never love again, you'll be safe." She touched his arm. "But you're not safe. You're only alone." Caleb shut his eyes, breath breaking in his chest. "What if I'm left again?" he asked quietly. "No one can promise you that won't happen." "Exactly. But Naomi is not your first wife," she said, "and you know that." He fell silent, long enough for the wind to shift. "Mother," he said at last, voice tightening, "I already love Naomi." It wasn't a confession. It was surrender. The admission of a man who had fought against a rising tide until he could no longer stand. She didn't smile or say she had known all along. She simply placed a hand on his back, a mother's touch for a son who had just unlocked a door he'd kept bolted for years. "Then go to her," she said, "before it's too late." Caleb looked up, his eyes red from a sleepless night. "I hurt her. She won't want to see me." "I'll tell you only one thing," she replied. "If you don't go, you will lose her forever." The words fell on him like the first rain of the season, neither cold nor sharp, but seeping deep. He stood. No speech, no plan, no guarantee Naomi would forgive him. Only the certainty, new, fragile, undeniable, of where his heart needed to go. Caleb grabbed his coat, unhitched his horse, and rode toward Dusthaven, where a black seamstress stitched fabric while carrying a tear in her heart that he had put there. Every hoofbeat was a pulse of regret. Every gust of wind was a sentence unsaid. Every dimming patch of sky was a quiet plea. Let me see her again. And for the first time in years, Caleb Rowan didn't run from his own heart. He rode straight toward it. Carter's sewing and design was quieter than usual that morning. Naomi sat at the cutting table, needle and thread still in her hand. She couldn't focus on a single stitch. Each breath caught in her chest, rising and sinking, rising and sinking. Outside the window, the street grew busier. Dusthaven woke with voices, wagons, hurried footsteps. But Naomi stood apart from it all. The silence inside her felt like a bottomless well. The doorbell chimed softly. Naomi looked up, and her whole body froze. Caleb stood in the doorway. Dust covered his coat. Mud stained his hands from the long ride. His hair was wind-tossed, his eyes tired, but not uncertain. No armor, no distance. Only a man looking at the woman he had wounded too deeply. He didn't step inside yet. He stood still, as if even a breath might make her disappear. Naomi gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. "What are you doing here?" she asked, voice small and shaking. Caleb said only, "I came to say what I should have said long ago." Silence dropped between them, long and heavy as late autumn dusk. He took one step, slow, like asking permission with every inch. "Naomi." Her name in his voice sounded more like a prayer. "I'm sorry." Naomi sniffed faintly and turned away. Sorry for what? For pushing me out? Or for the fact that in the end, I was only a contract? Caleb shook his head, stepping closer. Not a contract. Never a contract to me. You know that. But you chose to walk away from me. Her voice cracked at the end. Caleb heard that break as if it split open inside his own chest. I pushed you away because I was a fool, he said, without dodging. I thought distance would keep me from more pain. I thought love was only a doorway to being abandoned. I thought if I never loved again, I'd be safe. He drew a long, unsteady breath. But watching you walk away, I realized not loving you was the greatest loss of my life. Naomi's chest tightened. She had thought herself strong, thought anger would help her forget. But hearing this, every defense she had collapsed like fragile glass. Caleb stepped closer. 2 steps. 1. I love you, Naomi. His voice rasped like winter wind. I loved you earlier than I ever admitted. Before the night we spent together. Before our first kiss. Maybe, from the moment you stood in that ballroom, surrounded by contempt, yet you stood tall. Naomi lifted a hand to her mouth. Tears had already fallen. You made me want to be better, Caleb said, each word opening from the inside. You made me choose, not what was safe but what was right. You made me want to be with someone not out of duty, but out of my own heart. Naomi broke down. Not the cry of someone abandoned, but of someone finally hearing what she had hoped for until it hurt. Caleb reached her. Naomi, if you have even a little faith left in me, just a little, Please don't walk away from me again. Naomi didn't answer with words. She stepped toward him, slow, as if afraid the moment would vanish if she moved too fast, and before Caleb could say anything more, she leaned into him. Caleb wrapped his arms around her like a man who had found the most vital part of himself after losing it. Right there on Dusthaven's busy street, with wagons rolling past and wind sweeping along the roofs, they held each other tightly, as if every day before had led to this one moment. Naomi whispered into his shoulder, "Caleb, I still love you." Caleb drew her closer, pressing a trembling kiss to her hair. "This time I choose you, not because of a contract, not because of duty, because I want you, I need you, and I love you." Naomi closed her eyes. His warmth, something she thought she'd never touch again, had returned at last. In the middle of the noisy street, they stood still, unconcerned with who watched. In that moment, Dusthaven vanished. There was only the two of them. Two hearts stepping out of fear and toward each other. Dusthaven moved through early spring with a gentleness rarely seen. The breeze carried the scent of new earth, resin, and just enough warmth to make people linger outdoors. For Naomi, it was the season when her heart, after being torn, learned to open again like a flower meeting sunlight. And Caleb, the man who had lived inside duty and quiet wounds, was learning how to love in the kindest way he knew. Their dates were simple, quiet, and warm enough to make Naomi feel as if she had finally been placed in the right corner of the world. Each morning, he stood outside her sewing shop, hands in his coat pockets, that still, silent way of his that strangers mistook for aloofness. But Naomi knew better. It was the posture of a man waiting with his whole heart. He walked with her along the dirt road, where wild grass lined the path. Their hands brushed now and then. Each touch made Naomi's heartbeat slip. And Caleb, he always looked down at that fleeting touch, as if it were the most precious thing he had been allowed to hold. One afternoon, they stopped by the creek, the water clear enough to reflect every strand of hair. Naomi gathered her skirt and sat on a large rock. Caleb took the seat beside her. For a moment, neither spoke. They simply listened to water, wind, and the silence flowing between them. "I've thought," Caleb said quietly, "if there was a past life, I must have lost you once." Naomi smiled, eyes drifting to the water. "And you found me again in this one?" Caleb nodded slowly. "This time, I won't lose you." It was an ordinary sentence, yet it landed in a deep place inside her where people keep the truths that matter most. She didn't answer. She only looked at him with a softness that made Caleb pause just to breathe. He touched the small of her back, slow, steady, 1 second longer than needed. His kiss wasn't forceful. It was an admission that he was loving her piece by piece. On other evenings, he walked her back to the shop, and at the door he always bowed slightly to place a gentle kiss on her forehead. A kiss that made Naomi stand still as if even the wind stopped to watch. Soon, the town became used to seeing them together. No more sharp glances, no more hushed remarks. When a man loves a woman with kindness, the whole world notices quickly. One weekend, Caleb led Naomi up the hill behind the ranch. It wasn't a high hill, but it overlooked the entire valley like a great woven blanket stretching to the horizon. "Why bring me here?" Naomi asked. Caleb didn't answer right away. He guided her to an open patch where the grass was drying under the sun. They stopped. The wind brushed her skirt. Caleb turned to look at her as if holding the image in his memory forever. Then he took a slow breath. "Naomi," he said, voice deep and slightly trembling. I'm sorry for everything that hurt you. I'm sorry I pushed you away. I'm sorry for the past that blinded me. But there's one thing I've never regretted. He knelt. Naomi covered her mouth, her heartbeat striking hard against her ribs. Caleb opened a small ring box, a simple band, nothing ornate, yet shining as if polished by his own hands. His eyes never left hers. I want you to know, Caleb said, that this time I choose you, not because of a contract, not because of fear, not because of duty, but because my heart knows you are where I belong. Naomi's tears fell as their eyes met. Naomi Carter, Caleb whispered, almost taken by the wind. Will you marry me? Naomi broke. She fell into his arms, laughing through tears. Yes, Caleb, yes. He held her tightly, like a man finally returning home after years was lost on the trail. The wind stirred the hill, and the evening sun cast warm light across them. Naomi rested her head against his chest, hearing the easy rhythm of his heartbeat. And she knew from now on they would not love in fear. That morning, Dusthaven woke beneath the gentlest spring light. The apple trees outside the church carried their first blossoms, white petals falling on the steps like soft snow. People passing by smiled, for everyone knew it was Caleb Rowan and Naomi Carter's wedding day. Nothing loud, nothing showy, simply a wedding that warmed anyone who thought of it. In the small room behind the church, Naomi stood before the mirror. The dress she wore was made by her own hands, each stitch sewn on the quiet evenings after the shop had closed. The fabric rested softly on her shoulders. A light veil of lace brushed her wrists. It wasn't extravagant, but it held a quiet beauty that seemed to still the room. She placed a hand over her chest. Her heartbeat was steady, not out of fear, but from emotion. The door opened softly. Caleb's mother stepped in, her eyes lit with quiet joy. You look beautiful, Naomi, she said, her voice like a breath. Naomi smiled, fingers laced to keep from trembling. I never thought I'd have this day. Neither did I, the woman said. But Caleb changed when you came. Naomi bowed her head, eyes damp. It didn't need many words. Just that sentence was enough to still her heart. When the church bells rang, Naomi stepped out. At the entrance, Caleb waited. He wore a charcoal vest and simple tie, his hair neatly combed. But it wasn't the vest that made him stand out. It was his eyes. Caleb looked at her as if the whole world had gone silent. The people, the whispers, the wind through the windows, everything faded. Only she remained. Naomi walked forward, her dress brushing the wooden floor. When she reached him, he extended his hand and touched hers like something precious. You're beautiful, he murmured, just for her. Naomi smiled softly. I'm here because of you. They stood before the minister, facing a few rows of familiar faces, women who had ordered dresses from her shop, ranch hands who had seen the two endure storms together. Their vows carried no flourish, no dramatic tone, only truth spoken from the heart. Caleb spoke first. I choose you, Naomi, not for appearances, not for a contract, not from obligation. I choose you because you make me want to live more honestly, and because with you, I feel I can come home. Naomi tightened her hold on his hand. I can't promise there won't be hard days or moments of weakness, but I promise I'll stand beside you, with my heart, with my hands, with everything I have. When Caleb kissed her, the church seemed to breathe warmth. No applause, no noise, just the quiet of people witnessing two hearts finally finding where they belonged. From that day on, Rowan Ridge Ranch changed in ways no one expected. Laughter returned. Dinners grew fuller. In the kitchen, Naomi sometimes baked the cinnamon bread Caleb loved. Outside, he taught her to ride with a patience that surprised everyone. The once distant man now smiled far easier. In the evenings, when the ranch rested under dusk, Naomi stood on the porch, watching the workers return, the horses pass, and Caleb walking toward her with a peace she had never seen in him before. One evening, he wrapped his arms around her from behind and rested his chin on her shoulder. "Home," he whispered, "is where you are." Naomi leaned back into him, letting the breeze move through the grass around the porch, and she knew this ranch was not just where she lived. It was where she was loved, where she was chosen, where she belonged. 10 years on, Rowan Ridge passed the way grass grows and fades on a hillside. Slow, steady, leaving its most beautiful marks in places no one thinks to look. The ranch now stretched twice as wide as the day Naomi arrived with a small cloth bag and a heart unsure of where it belonged. Fences rebuilt, barns strengthened, porches repaired. But the clearest change wasn't in wood or stone. It was in the laughter. The laughter of their 3 children. A boy with clear stream-water eyes who chased birds across the yard. A curly-haired girl who climbed into Naomi's lap to play with scraps of thread. And the youngest, who clung to Caleb's leg whenever he worked outside, making him pretend to grumble while his eyes softened in a way everyone could see. Naomi's mother still lived in the small cottage behind the ranch. Her breath was easier now, her smile brighter, her once trembling hands steady again. "My daughter chose well," she often said. Naomi never answered. She simply looked out to the yard where Caleb carried their little girl on his back, and her heart softened the way it did the first day she knew she loved him. That evening, as the sun tilted low, they climbed the hill behind the ranch. It was where Caleb had first held her hand. A nervous, unsteady hand full of things he hadn't yet learned to say. The hill was the same. Wind moving gently, grass whispering, the distant stream catching the soft gold of dusk. Naomi took in the familiar view. She was no longer the unsure seamstress stepping into a new life. She was Caleb Rowan's wife, mother of their 3 children. A woman who had weathered storms, winters, lean seasons, and full ones at his side. Caleb came to stand beside her, his hand settling on her back the way it always did. His warmth said enough without needing words. "You remember this place?" he asked, his voice low, like wind brushing a coat sleeve. Naomi smiled. "How could I forget? You held my hand here first." "Yes," he said. "I was so scared my hand almost shook." "And now?" He didn't answer. Instead, he took a narrow wooden box from his coat. Naomi watched him. Curiosity stirred with something tender. He opened it. Inside wasn't a ring, nor a gift, but a sheet of paper, its edges faintly yellowed from being kept too carefully. "What is it?" she asked. Caleb handed it to her. "A new contract." Naomi let out a quiet laugh, soft enough the wind seemed to slow to hear. She unfolded it. The first line tightened her chest. "Contract to love each other every day. No clause against feelings. No time limit. No ending in any season of life." At the bottom, in Caleb's handwriting, the only term, "Stay together all our lives." Naomi covered her mouth, eyes warm with tears. She didn't cry loud. She never had. But her shoulders trembled like water touched by wind. Caleb stepped close, his thumb brushing a tear from her cheek. I lost you once, he whispered. I won't let it happen again. Not ever. Naomi looked up at him, her gaze deep and calm as the fading light. You don't need a contract to keep me, Caleb. I know. He lowered his forehead to hers. But I want to sign this with you, not to bind, but to remind me how lucky I am. Naomi smiled. She signed her name in the corner, a gentle curve of ink like the name of someone who had finally found where she belonged. When she handed it back, Caleb didn't put it away. He held it, like a vow shaped by 10 years of growing alongside her. Then he drew her into his arms. His kiss was soft as the apple blossoms drifting down the church steps years ago. Not fierce, not claiming, but the kiss of two people who had endured much and still chose each other, steady, honest, whole. Evening wind moved across the hill. Grass leaned. The stream shimmered like a ribbon of time. And on that hill, where everything once began, their story closed with a kiss. A kiss light as breath, but enough to say they would keep loving each other through every season still to come. If this story touched a quiet place in you, one that once hurt, once lost something, yet still hopes for gentleness, please leave a small comment below. Tell me the moment of Naomi and Caleb you remember most. And if you'd like to hear more warm stories like this, feel free to like, subscribe, and share so the channel can keep bringing these tales to hearts that have weathered many winds.